Hello everybody, this is Kanya Eckhart. Welcome to my YouTube channel once again. This evening I'm wearing a plaid miniskirt and a lace see-through top. Both of these items I recently also purchased at Forever 21. And I have some accessories, bracelets, and a couple of necklaces to accentuate this outfit. So let me just briefly model this for you so that you can get the look. Here's the skirt, and here's the top, which is kind of a nice white complement to the mustard color of the plaid skirt. So I'm very pleased with this outfit, and I look forward to wearing it many times in the future. Let me just give you one more look at it here. There you go. And I'm wearing these tan high heels to also to complement color-wise the entire ensemble, so I hope that you like it. What I'd like to do this evening is take a kind of a personal turn in this evening's video. I want to start out by mentioning that this is the 1-year anniversary of my mother's death. She passed away this day last year. She was 94 years old. And she basically, what happened was that she had contracted colon cancer. They discovered this mass in her colon that turned out to be malignant. There was an operation, but unfortunately, immediately after the operation, she suffered a stroke. And in the course of time, very quickly, it turned out that this was going to be an irreparable stroke, not simply a temporary one, so that she was no longer able to consume food or water. And since she had a do not resuscitate order, it was in fairly short order that she succumbed to natural causes of death when you can no longer ingest food and water. So last year at this time, I spent about a month in my childhood home in Tennessee dealing with the various aspects of her diagnosis, followed by the operation, the surgery, then the stroke. Shortly after that, we had to move her into hospice care. And since I'm an only child, that responsibility fell solely to me, which is a good thing in a way in that I was able to have all the control, but on the other hand, it's difficult because that was my sole responsibility. I had to bear that burden mostly alone, but that's okay. That was the least I could do. And then finally, her passing, and I had to make funeral arrangements with her minister, and then begin to set up her estate. So it was a very long and complicated process with different challenges along the way, and fortunately I was able to get through that. But I wanted to share some personal reminiscences about that because I know that some of my viewers are going through some personal crises of their own, and so I thought maybe it would help if I could share that. And I want to come around at the very end of my remarks to how this had an effect, not just on me, my personally, emotionally, but also in the kind of work that I do in philosophy and theology. So I want to come back to that at the end. But what I wanted to focus on primarily was when my mother had passed away, I met with the pastor of her church. My mother attended a Lutheran church. She was a Lutheran. I was actually born and raised in that church. I was raised a Lutheran. I'm a Roman Catholic now. But the pastor of her church was very kind, and so he and I worked together to co-arrange her funeral service, and I was responsible for doing the eulogy at that funeral service. So just going back a little bit, the night before my mother had her surgery, she met with her pastor and with me, and we prayed with her, and also the morning before she went right into surgery. And I believe it was the evening before, there was a particular verse from the Gospel of St. Luke where Jesus, early on in his ministry, is going through the crowds, and this woman who has some kind of, it's an issue of blood, or some kind of blood disease, she follows Jesus, and she doesn't directly come up to him face to face, but she touches his garment, and he feels the power of healing go out of him, and the woman, he turns around and says, well, who touched me? I felt that somebody touched the hem of my robe, and the power has gone out of me. And the woman fearfully confesses that she had done it. And Jesus said, well, your faith has made you well, has healed you, so go in peace. And so she's healed. So the reason that my mother's pastor and I shared that scripture with her is that it seemed particularly appropriate. We were hoping for Jesus for Christ to share his grace with her, for there to be an outflowing of his grace upon her that would bring her successfully through that surgery, and that she would be healed as much as possible. She was basically facing a terminal diagnosis, but if she had come through the surgery, she could have had a colostomy bag, and maybe in time she could have elected perhaps to have chemotherapy. She might have gotten a few more months or maybe even a year or so more out of her life if the surgery had been successful, if she hadn't had a stroke. But in any event, after she passed, and I was in the course of preparing my remarks for her eulogy, I came back to that scripture, and the reason I did was that before my mother went into surgery, and even before she met with her pastor and me, there was a young woman nurse that she became very, very friendly with. And what was interesting about this is that this young woman, I may have mentioned this in a previous video, but let me say a little bit more about it now. This young woman was having a lot of difficulties in her life. I think that there were, aside from romantic problems, maybe she was seeking some kind of direction, some kind of focus. And so she and my mother really hit it off. And my mother read some poetry to her and discussed various ideas. And this young woman was very, very taken with my mother. So after my mother died, this young nurse who had been on the ward where my mother was staying actually sent a letter to me at my mother's address. It was a beautiful letter where she shared how my mother had made such a powerful impression upon her in a relatively short amount of time. And so what occurred to me when I was reflecting on this, and as well as on the scripture from St. Luke, it was a kind of a surprise. In a way, what had happened was that Christ's power had really been manifested in this very difficult situation, but he had touched someone, but not in the way that I had expected. Initially, I had expected or hoped and prayed that his grace would touch my mother and would bring her through that surgery successfully and make her as healthy as possible for as long as possible. But actually, it wasn't that way that the grace was working. It was rather the grace was coming through my mother to touch this young woman, because obviously in a very, very short period of time, my mother was able to make a powerful and deep impression, positive impression, on this young woman. And I feel very strongly in faith that that was Christ's grace working through my mother in a way that perhaps my mother's pastor and I did not initially expect, since we were expecting the grace to come to my mother. We were hoping for that, but it came to somebody else through my mother in a way that was similar to what happened in that story I just told or related from the Gospel of Luke. So I think that's very interesting, and it's kind of a sign of how God works in very mysterious ways, as the saying goes, and often grace comes in an unexpected way. It comes, but not in the way that we initially think it should or expect it should. That doesn't mean that it isn't working, and I really feel that that's what happened in that particular episode, so I'm very thankful for that, and I believe my mother would be very grateful for that as well. It was difficult to see her go through that suffering and be with her as she diminished. I know that she would not have wanted to be in that situation, but on the other hand, mercifully, maybe there was a blessing in disguise here, because she did not have to go through a procedure. If this first surgery had been successful, she did not, she would have had to receive a colostomy bag and look at the possibility of chemotherapy, as I mentioned, and at least she was spared all of that. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise. Now, when I gave my mother's eulogy, at the end of the eulogy, I quoted this beautiful passage from Søren Kierkegaard, someone, as you know, those of you who have been following my videos know, has been very influential on my own thinking and the development of my own theological ideas recently. And Kierkegaard speaks, it's a beautiful phrase he uses about the person of faith comes to rest in the transparency of God, and something to that effect, in the transparency before God, and so that God sort of sees the person is clearly there in this kind of transparency with God, in the transparency of the power that established it. I think it was something like that. The faithful person who has lived a Christian life and comes to the end of it comes to rest in the transparency of the being God who established it. So I used that phrase at the end of my mother's eulogy because I thought it was very appropriate. And I want to conclude tonight's video by saying something about how my time in Tennessee dealing with my mother's situation also had an effect on my own thinking. At that time I was completing my third book on Heidegger. This was a book that was dealing with the so-called theology of Streit that I have discussed in some of my previous videos. And I've written 3 books on Heidegger, one from a kind of neo-scholastic position, then the next 2 were from this more non-metaphysical position, one dealing with Gelassenheit theology, and then the one I just mentioned dealing with the theology of Streit. And so I was finishing that up, but at the time, it was also, perhaps other things were beginning to have an effect upon me, because I started reading these more existentialist writers like Kierkegaard and like Nietzsche, whom I've also discussed in some of my previous videos, who, if not an existentialist, is certainly dealing with more practical things like life and doubt, joy and suffering and sorrow and all those things, sort of those human emotions and those very visceral phenomena. So I think what happened here is that in a way that this kind of godly grace, this Christ's grace was working through my mother unexpectedly to touch this young woman's life and to have a positive impact upon it. In a way, I feel that sort of unexpectedly, at the time I was really committed to that second Heideggerian non-metaphysical theology of Streit that I have described. But then I think, in a way, grace was coming through that very difficult and almost existentialist situation of dealing with my mother's demise, her death, and her illness and so forth, and was starting to sort of break down my ways of thinking to the point that now that I finished that book on Heidegger's theology of Streit, I no longer agree with that. As many of you have seen who've been following this series, I have some serious concerns, some serious reservations about that, which has led me in a more positive direction to develop this very Kierkegaardian influenced or Kierkegaardian inflected theology, this neue theologische Anschauung, this new theological perspective, as I like to call it, that I have been sharing with you, developing and defending in various ways. And so I think that this was an instance where, grace was working out here in my own intellectual life in a way that was quite unexpected and that was parallel to the way grace was at work in an unexpected way in my mother's own situation to help somebody, a total stranger, find some kind of clarity and direction in her life based on this very brief encounter with this older woman, my mother, that the nurse had never really known before. So I think that's very interesting, and that's all I really wanted to say this evening. It was very difficult dealing with that situation, and I certainly missed my mother a great deal, but I'm glad that she's not suffering anymore. So that's all I wanted to say, and until next time, this is Katja Eckhart, thanking you again for sharing some time with me, and I wish everybody, as always, a very restful and peaceful and safe evening. Until next time, I wish you all the best. This is Katja, and I look forward to sharing some more reflections with you in future videos. Thanks again so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Good night.